Welcome to the Family Office Sherpa podcast. I'm your host, Shaun Parkin, founder and managing director of Whole Road Investments. The aim of this podcast is to provide practical and implementable advice for those looking to build, manage, or service a family office. This is not, however, investment advice, so please check the disclaimer in the show notes. In this episode, I'm covering when the family office splits.
This is the Family Office Sherpa.
So, what are we talking about? We're talking about when, well, as the name implies, it splits. There's usually a family member or even the entire family office moves from one single family office to multiple. Now, where I've seen this happen, they can move to, they're under the umbrella of the main office, and they have received, there might be an estate planning thing. There might be when the patriarch or matriarch passes away, and then they take their inheritance or their allocation and move and start their own one. Or it may be that they just wanted to move out onto their own even when the original starters of the office are still there. There's many reasons. They're not always negative. Sometimes they're really positive. I thought I would just go through today a thematic that was mentioned to me by Ray Denunzio at TOS Advisory, that they're starting to see that thematic in the States. We're starting to see it here in Asia Pacific, but really just sort of going, well, what's happening? Why does this happen? And then what's some of the planning that we can put in place to make this potential transition less painful, but also keep the doors open to people coming back together? So I thought I'd start with a list and then the end sort of going through some of the negatives and how we can retain people. But yeah, a thematic that we're starting to see across the board, especially as we go through generations, especially as we go through liquidity events and things like that. And for family offices to become a legitimate vehicle for a lot of people. Okay, so why would they do this? What's the thematic of this transition? What we see is that sometimes it's the younger members looking for autonomy, or to align their wealth with their personal values. It's not to say that they don't align a lot of the time, but you do see some going, well, this office and this investment policy or this governance or the way that we're investing or the way that our purpose is put together doesn't align with my personal values. And what we're going to do is we're going to move our assets out and we're going to start another one, which is going to be heavily aligned. The next one sort of being within why do people do it is there's different attitudes towards investing, purpose, and things like technology. There's things that can cause disengagement from a lack of inclusion or communication, not necessarily always conflict, but sometimes conflict. So what that disengagement tends to be is not including in decisions, not being included in things like purpose documents, investment policy, and those governance type documents. And many departures I find are really about to a certain degree, their identity. We're looking for independence, and a lot of the time there's an idea of evolution here. So that tends to be some of the thematics around why. Now the next one is what are the challenges that we see here? Fragmentation can be a natural stage of growth, but you've got to evolve and you've got to expand. So that's why some people do it. What can happen when this fragmentation occurs is there's an emotional strain on people. Fragmentation doesn't necessarily mean failure. In fact, it rarely means failure. It can reflect a healthy transition, and like I said before, there's an element of independence there. But what it does is you've also got to understand when you do move away from something that is, especially those offices that are quite well established, they have their own goals and values and investment policy. When there is that fragmentation, the challenge is going to be to reestablish all of that. So the other main point around here, so let's call it the point number 3, is how should we make these decisions? I found that unplanned exits can destabilize a lot. So from investments, relationships, there's tax implications, there's all sorts of different things. So I would say you should make these decisions with a plan. And I think the best way to have it is you put these contingencies in your governance structure. So we make these decisions, you give optionality here. Optionality to leave, optionality to come back, but optionality. And I think within the governance tools that we have, which are things like agreements, you've got frameworks that are put together in terms of the infrastructure. If you can have that governance tool in place, so there's a calm, pre-agreed process which prevents sort of reactive, emotionally driven choices and reduces chaos. Because like anything, I mean, and chaos is maybe potentially a strong word here, but you don't want uncertainty and you don't want friction. You want this to be a happy place, and you want it to be, because it's people and it's family. So you want this to be planned, but you also give that optionality. So I think the way that I've seen this work really well in terms of making these decisions is to have made these decisions before, not as they're happening, not reactively. So that's the way that I would sort of make these decisions. And I can't stress this enough, that you should have this inbuilt somewhere within your governance structure. What happens if A wants to take their assets out of the office, even if, they might not be able to? Like there's all sorts of different things that, you got to think about. But like I said, the reasons are still going to be there. So someone's desire to be independent and to have their own investments align with their values or something like that doesn't just go away because they can't do it now. So I think we talk about the sustainability of these family offices, and I think a good, well-planned, sustainable office has these mechanisms, these governance tools in place first. So number 4. So what are some of the positives of going out on your own in terms of a single family office? What I've found sometimes is independence can almost create this unleashes energy of some version of it. Like, this is mine. Nothing narrows the focus like responsibility. The people that are starting these new offices are now responsible for the stewardship of these assets. There is the P&L, the sustainability, the staffing choices, all these sorts of things now come down to them. And sometimes that energizes people. Sometimes it doesn't, because administratively burdensome. And sometimes the idea is, well, I want this, but I will give it to someone else, like a multifamily office or an advisor or something like that. But there is an element I see a lot of the time, which is this, this is mine now. Now I have control. And sometimes that's daunting and sometimes that's exciting. So sometimes that's a positive. Another one within that sort of positive is that separation, when this is handled respectfully and in a positive manner as opposed to a negative manner, it can preserve those sort of long-term family relationships. Because if left to fester, I think some of the family offices that are saying, well, as soon as I can, I'm out, but I can't, or something like that, or some version of I just want to be free of this. That element can create, poor outcomes. But if you do this, and like I said, in a way that is more aligned to harmony and giving them optionality and things like that, then I think that if it's a good experience, it can really preserve those long-term relationships. Another one that I've seen is that in particular sort of next generations that might have a more of an entrepreneurial or impact or whatever it ends up being, it means they can truly have some agency and some ownership there. And sometimes it actually benefits the returns significantly. And especially that entrepreneurial piece, I find that, I want to gain access to this wealth, not necessarily just to have control, but there's a specific goal here. I would like to invest, or I would like to start a business, or I would like to do this there's that entrepreneurial piece where as soon as someone gets some backing, and that backing is in the form of family wealth or family assets, they go and they spend their time in an entrepreneurial or impact fashion. So I think that's I've seen that as a positive as well. The other thing as well is that autonomy, like sometimes, like anything, when your kids move out of home and they have to pay their own bills and they have to buy look after their own mortgage and things like that, that it does deepen the appreciation for what you did as parents. I didn't realize there was this much life admin. I didn't realize there were this many, moving parts to what this, the original single family office does. So it does create appreciation for the level of complexity that's being managed within this structure. So that's one of I find that a positive, because I think any sort of self-reflection or understanding of the effort that others put in, I think, is a really good thing. So that's just some of the positives. The flip side of that, number 5 being, what are some of the negatives that I've seen and from contacts and clients and things like that, which is number 1. So there's a financial and structural disruption. So one of the good things about having everyone together is you got scale. So you will lose some of that scale. And so from an investment perspective and from an efficiency perspective, sometimes that can be really disruptive. Shared resources no longer become part of that as well. And those shared resources might be internal staff. It might be all these sorts of things that are only available because of the size of the office. And once you become, to a certain degree, subscale, then you're no longer able to support those. So then it becomes a question of insourcing and outsourcing, which adds more complexity, because you then have to decide what you're going to do yourself and what you're going to have others do for you. So there's this element of, well, once we were this big and we meant this to these suppliers, and now we're this big and now we don't. It's not to say you can fix that through outsourcing. You can fix it through thoughtful curation of your infrastructure. But I'm just saying that disruptive component can be problematic. Another one in that negative is sometimes you do see it was the emotional and relationship fallout. There's no one, it's not like a breakup or anything. You're still family and you're still part of that unit, but, well, hopefully. But there does sometimes create tension. There is something like, when you're outside of that now, sometimes, and you're not privy to every decision being made at the main office levels, and sometimes people do find that creates tension and some friction. Another one is the increased governance risk and potentially reputational risk, because, like I said, you're getting away from something that is potentially, or hopefully, very well run, very well structured, very having some of those governance structures in place. When you don't have them and they're not established first, then that can be an increased risk. And now this is all under the thought or the idea that the main office is run really well. And so these negatives of moving away from a very well-run, structured office hold water. But like I said, not all. Some of the reasons why people split from the main office is not necessarily because it's well run; it's because it potentially is not as well run as they would like. So just keep that in mind as well, and take that into consideration. The last one there being there's strategic and generational, I guess, consequences. When I talk about that, I mean there's also when you set up the strategy and the purpose and things like that, there's a vision, or there's a legacy intention, and sometimes this can fragment it, because the idea is that this office would be intergenerational, and then if it fragments or becomes not intergenerational, then that vision is potentially weakened, because we don't have that transition into the next generation. And you do lose that next generation engagement, which is potentially what we're looking for here. So I think those offices that are one and done, in terms of it's not an intergenerational, it's not stewardship, then that's less of an implication there. But most have some idea that this money in this office will be ongoing and service the next generation. So if there is a fragmentation there, then that vision and that legacy potentially there's some consequences for it. So something to think about. The other things to think about. So what are the steps that we can take? So these are the more practical components of it, which is really plan before the exits happen. Build them, like I said, build them into the governance framework, because that's what's going to remove some of the emotion from this process. And it is an emotional process, right? Really have an idea that there is going to be an ability for them to come back within that governance structure. So just because they're leaving doesn't mean that we want to close the door. We want to leave space for reconnection and re-engagement in the future. And it's not necessarily that they need to give up their independence and things like that. Sometimes this is the catalyst that we need for that next generation engagement. So, but leave space for reconnection or continued connection. I think that's incredibly important. And you do that through good communication. I don't know if and I was on a panel discussion the other day or yesterday, and it was around sort of internal communication. And one of the family members said, I don't think there's a case of over communicating within their family. There's only good communication. So keeping those ideas driven, those lines of communication open during this process or prior and post this process is such an important thing. From a more practical point of view, having the legal and tax structures is so important, and getting good advice within that is so important, like the downstream impact of this. So understanding where things like shared assets, obligations, and risks intersect, and where they are going to remain, because there is always going to be remaining intersections here. So if you're looking to start an office or fragment, or the office is looking to split, then being aware and mapping that and planning that and getting it from a tax, like I said, a tax and legal perspective, getting that in place first before anything happens is just so important. So that's what my thoughts are. Admittedly, you don't see it happen very often. I mean, you do see it. I mean, there's a thematic there that people are starting their own offices and things like that. But in my experience, I think most people are still looking to retain connectivity with the rest of the family, staying in those components. But you still see it, and you don't. And it's, like I said, it's not necessarily a negative thing. So, if a final thought here, which is that these splits shouldn't be seen as weaknesses. Sometimes they're a sign of evolution. Right? If you think about the most storied families, there's multiple, it might have been start with the patriarch and the matriarch, but there are multiple versions of that. And they're called different things, and they're cousins and their brothers and sisters, and sometimes they connect and then they start their own and things like that. But I think sometimes that's the evolution. And it's not to say that they're not still connected. And I think there's some very good templates out there. There's some very good families that have, started smaller ones, or the cousins and brothers, like I said, they've started smaller ones out there, but still retain that connectivity. So I think there's an evolution there. But you got to plan for that transition. If you do it with things like empathy, with structure, and foresight, like I said, having some plan, having some element of, well, what happens if they want to do this? How do we support it? How do we get it? How do we make it efficient, and how do we reduce some of the risk of it? You can do things like you can preserve both wealth and you can preserve connection. So I would say that thoughtful versions of this can be incredibly successful from an emotional and financial perspective. So that's what it is. Good governance, isn't just keeping everyone together forever. A lot of the time it's about making sure that when we do diverge, or when paths diverge, those relationships endure. So I thought that was a good topic to sort of cover here. If you're interested in understanding how I work with clients, on topics like this and getting that governance structure in place, please feel free to email me, Shaun, so SHAUN @hallroad.com.au. Or you can message me on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active on that. If you enjoyed the podcast, please ding the little alert bell so you get a notification. If you feel like rating it, that'd be great as well. If you're looking for all the things Family Office Sherpa, there's a dedicated website, thefamilyofficesherpa.com, where podcasts, newsletter, guides, and videos. But until next time, thanks for listening.